Howard Stern called Whitney Houston too fat to perform. 6 days later, she walked onto a stage and made 20,000 people forget how to breathe. If you've never heard this story, stick around. Because this isn't about a celebrity clapping back at a radio host. This is about a woman who had been quietly carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations for 15 years. And the night she finally put all of it down. Subscribe if you're new here. We tell the stories that don't make the highlight reels. It was a Tuesday morning in the fall of 1996 when Howard Stern said it. He was doing what he always did, sitting behind that microphone in his Manhattan studio, a cup of bad coffee somewhere nearby, his producers laughing on cue. A tabloid photo of Whitney had made the rounds that week. One of those grainy, unflattering shots that the paparazzi specialize in. Caught mid-step, wrong angle, wrong light. The kind of photo that's designed to do one thing, make you feel small. Stern held it up on camera for his television simulcast and laughed. "Look at this. I'm sorry, but this woman cannot perform anymore. She can't breathe up there. She's done." His co-host laughed. The studio laughed. And somewhere across the city, that sound found its way to the wrong pair of ears. Whitney's assistant got the call first. She was the one who had to decide whether to tell her. Whether to walk into that apartment on a Tuesday morning and hand her boss a piece of paper with a radio transcript on it. She stood outside the door for a long moment, transcript in hand, trying to figure out if there was a gentle way to do this. There isn't. There never is. She knocked. Whitney answered in a robe, hair wrapped, coffee in hand. She looked at her assistant's face and knew before a word was spoken. "What now?" Whitney said. It wasn't even a question. She read the transcript once, set it face down on the kitchen counter, picked up her coffee again. "What's the date on the garden show?" she asked. 6 days. Whitney nodded slowly. "Call the band." Here's what people forget about Whitney Houston in 1996. She wasn't struggling. Not vocally, not creatively. The Waiting to Exhale soundtrack had just come out, and Exhale Shoop Shoop was everywhere. In grocery stores, in elevators, coming out of car windows on the highway. The album had debuted at #1. She had just filmed The Preacher's Wife with Denzel Washington, but the tabloids had decided a different story was more interesting. The weight conversation had started quietly, the way these things always do. A comment in a magazine column here, a mention on a late-night show there. Then it grew into something uglier, this ongoing public accounting of her body, as if her body belonged to everyone who bought her records. As if the voice inside it was somehow conditional on what the outside looked like. Whitney had said nothing publicly, not one word. She had learned that silence was sometimes the only dignified response. Her mother, Sissy, had taught her that. You don't feed what you want to die. You starve it. You go back to work. But Howard Stern's words were different. They had a specific cruelty to them. Not just the observation, but the certainty. She can't breathe up there. She's done. Done. That word sat in Whitney Houston's kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and it refused to leave. She grew up in Newark, New Jersey, which is not the kind of place that produces fragile people. The church was everything. New Hope Baptist Church, where her mother Sissy was the choir director, and her cousin Dionne Warwick sometimes came to visit, and her godmother was Aretha Franklin. Just sit with that for a second. Aretha Franklin was at family dinners. That was the baseline. Whitney started singing in that church when she was 11 years old. And what happened in that building, what she felt standing at that microphone in front of those pews, was never about performance. It was about something that moved through her, not from her. She was always very clear about that distinction. "When I sing," she said once in an interview, "I'm not thinking about my voice. I'm thinking about what the song is asking me to give." That's a gospel singer talking, not a pop star. But the music industry that signed her in 1983 didn't want a gospel singer. They wanted something else entirely. Clive Davis had a vision. Precise, commercial, beautiful. Arista Records was going to take this 19-year-old girl from Newark and turn her into the most polished pop voice of a generation. And she did. God help her. She did all of it. She was the good girl. She wore the gowns. She gave the gracious interviews. She hit every note they asked for in every key they chose. And she never once walked out of a recording session. She became Whitney Houston, the brand, so completely that sometimes even she had trouble finding the girl from New Hope Baptist underneath all of it. Nobody talks about how exhausting that is. 15 years of being exactly what everyone needed you to be, until a Tuesday morning when a man on the radio said she was done. The 6 days between that morning and the Madison Square Garden show were quiet ones. She didn't do interviews. She didn't call anyone. Her inner circle knew to give her space. Not the cold, closed-off kind, but the working kind. The kind where she was somewhere inside herself, building something. She spent time at the piano, not rehearsing the set list specifically, just playing. Working through things the way musicians do when words aren't enough. There's a kind of thinking that only happens with your hands on an instrument and your voice in the room. And Whitney was doing that kind of thinking. Her vocal coach, a woman she'd worked with for years, offered to come by. Whitney thanked her and said no. "I know what I need," she told her. "I just need a few days to find it again." That sentence is worth pausing on. Find it again. Not build it, not fix it. Find it. As if it was always there, had always been there. And the noise of the past few weeks had simply buried it under too much other stuff. She was right, of course. It had never gone anywhere. The night of the show, something felt different from the moment she arrived at the venue. The garden was sold out. 20,000 people. This wasn't a surprise. Whitney Houston had been selling out Madison Square Garden for years. But there was a specific electricity in the air that night that her stage manager noticed immediately. He'd worked with her through most of the 90s. He knew her crowds. There was this weird tension, he said years later, like people had read the tabloids and come to see something, but they weren't sure what. Some of them had come to be inspired. Some of them, honestly, had come out of morbid curiosity. The same reason people slow down on the highway. Whitney knew this. She stood in the wings for a long moment before her entrance. The house lights were down. The band was already on stage. The crowd noise was that particular roar that comes right before an artist appears. Anticipatory, almost impatient. She closed her eyes. She wasn't praying exactly. Or maybe she was. It's hard to know the difference sometimes between prayer and the moment you decide to trust yourself completely. They feel the same from the inside. She took one breath. Long, slow, from somewhere deep. And she walked out. The spotlight found her at center stage. For just a half second, and people who were there that night still talk about this, the crowd went quieter than it should have. Not silent, but quieter, like the air had changed. She gripped the microphone, both hands just briefly, before settling into her stance, and then she opened her mouth. What came out wasn't a song yet. It was a single note. One note held long enough to fill every corner of that enormous room, climbing as it went. Not loud at first, but getting there. Building from somewhere below the sound system's ability to contain it, until it wasn't just coming from the stage anymore. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from somewhere inside the chest of every single person in that building. The crowd didn't scream. Not immediately, they gasped. There's a difference, and it matters enormously. A scream is a reaction. A gasp is something involuntary. Something that happens to you before your brain has processed what your body already knows. 20,000 people gasped at the same time, and then the sound that followed was unlike anything her stage manager had heard in years of working concerts. It wasn't just applause. It was relief, like something had been resolved that none of them had known was unresolved. Like a question had been answered that nobody had admitted they were asking. She sang for 2 hours and 15 minutes that night. She sang like someone with something to prove, yes, but that wasn't the whole of it. She also sang like someone who had finally remembered why she started. Like the girl from New Hope Baptist was back, standing at that microphone in those pews, letting something move through her instead of performing at it. Between songs, she barely spoke. A thank you here, a smile there. She didn't address the tabloids. She didn't mention Howard Stern. She didn't give a speech about strength or resilience or not letting other people define you. She didn't need to. Every note was the speech. Near the end of the show, she paused at the edge of the stage and looked out at the crowd for a long moment. Just looked. 20,000 people looking back at her, and she smiled. Not the professional, camera-ready smile that had been photographed 10,000 times, but a real one, slow and full and a little tired around the edges. "Thank you for being here," she said quietly. That was all. The next morning, Howard Stern was back in his studio. His phone lines were flooded with callers who had been at the Garden or who knew someone who had been or who had heard about it secondhand with that particular urgency of people who need to tell you that something unbelievable just happened. Stern was quiet for longer than usual. One of his producers, someone who had laughed the loudest at that photo 6 days earlier, leaned into the microphone and said simply, "So Howard, what do you say?" Stern picked up his coffee, set it back down. "Okay," he said, "just that. Okay. 2 letters. 6 days in the making." It wasn't a formal apology. Howard Stern didn't really do those things. But everyone who was listening understood what okay meant in that studio. She won. Whitney Houston never talked about that week publicly. She never brought it up in interviews. Never used it as an anecdote about overcoming adversity. Never let it become part of her official mythology the way some artists would have. Because here's the thing about people who were raised in church, raised to believe that the gift came from somewhere bigger than themselves. They don't really think of those moments as personal victories. They think of them as reminders. The voice was never hers to lose. It was never Howard Stern's to take away. It was never a tabloid photographer's to undermine. It was just there. Like it had always been there, since those first Sunday mornings in Newark when an 11-year-old girl opened her mouth and a whole congregation went still. Some things don't diminish. Some things don't age or change or go away just because someone cruel points a camera at the wrong angle on a bad day. Some things are just true, regardless of what the radio says. Whitney Houston knew that. She had always known that. On the night of that Madison Square Garden show, she just reminded the rest of us. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations, only to silence them with your true gift? Tell us your story in the comments below.